Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for coming out this morning on this rainy summer day. I've been living in LA and I completely forgot what this country is like. I didn't bring a coat. I did bring an umbrella though, so I'm okay. Thanks to Jerwood Visual Arts and Film and Video Umbrella and the Centre for Contemporary Arts for making this event happen and bringing us all together for what I'm sure will be a very stimulating day's discussion. As Stephen has noted, Tomorrow Never Knows is an evocative title for this day. It was made in 1966 and it's truly a prophetic piece of music. Probably the first track in rock to really break with the idea of recording as a document of a live performance. Instead, it's the creation of a sort of pseudo-event that never actually happened, constructed from all these different layers and processed sounds, and so it's kind of playing games with time. And it was immediately inspirational in terms of, you know, psychedelia and things that people like Jimi Hendrix would do. But it looks ahead to the studio as instrument approach of people like Brian Eno, who would actually cover Tomorrow Never Knows in 1976 when he was in a super group called 801 with Roxy Music's Phil Manzanera. And also you can hear in its kind of tape collage, you can hear hints of a sample-based sonic phantasmagoria to come in the 80s and 90s, the Art of Noise and Chemical Brothers and all kinds of 90s groups. Chemical Brothers' 1996 single Setting Sun is audibly like a homage or a sort of distorted mirror image of Tomorrow Never Knows. So it's a great, as a title for a symposium on the subject of the future and what's happened to it, have we mislaid it somehow? It's very apt. However, the title itself is actually saying something quite different. It's Tomorrow Never Knows comes from a sort of garbled saying of Ringo Starr's, and no one's really sure what he meant, but in the context of this song, which the lyrics are derived from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, I believe, what it sort of means to signify is a sort of earthy Liverpudlian version of the more earnest Zen-scented 60s maxim, be here now. So basically it's saying, you know, don't think about the future, don't worry about the consequences, do it now. It's that sort of classic youth culture, pop music imperative. Forget the past, don't worry about the future, live in the present. And in his classic book, Revolt into Style, written at the very end of the 60s, George Melly described pop culture as the country of now. And he argued that the nation of youth denies having any history. The words, do you remember, are the filthiest in its language. And Melly made this claim. Specifically, he was talking about the sort of the precursors to pop culture and youth culture, specifically in the context of trad jazz, which was the 50s British revival of hot 1920s jazz from New Orleans, a scene in which he was involved. And Melly argues that trad jazz, while it was exuberant and it was informal, it wasn't a true pop phenomenon. Partly because it wasn't the exclusive property of young people, but mostly because it was a revival. And so, you know, by his definition, pop music could not be nostalgic. By the time Revolt into Style got into the bookshops, though, pop culture was already deep into its first major outbreak of revivalism. The rock and roll 50s revival, which started in about 1969, it carried on fitfully through most of the 70s. It's the first of many revivals in pop history. So Melly's idea that pop culture is, you know, intrinsically the country of now and not about remembering things, or is already disproved by the time his book actually is out there. And one of the arguments in my book Retromania is that as pop culture built up a history, an archive, it starts to become torn by these two impulses. There's the drive to keep pushing forward versus a drive to repeat and reenact and to hark back wistfully to an earlier golden age, usually the era of its own emergence, pop's own youth. I passed an example of this on the way here. There's a theatre just a few doors down, and there's a band called a tribute band called Roxy Magic that are playing, supported by the sensational David Bowie experience. So that's a good example of this, this way that pop music from quite early on starts to fall back on its own history, and is now extremely folded and completely tangled up in its own past. So I personally, I've always aligned myself strongly with this, the sort of the push forward continuously side of pop music and pop culture, believing that its sort of essence really is this emphasis on the now and on the next. And in that, I'm sort of the creature of when I grew up and the things I grew up with. So it would be not just pop music, but science fiction books and science fiction films and TV, and then various forms of modernist art and 20th century avant-garde that sort of filtered down to be one way or another, often actually via rock culture. And then in the background of that would be the space race and then that sort of generalized post-war ideology of progress. Very much like a child of the 60s. I was born in 1963, and the things that I value most in music, or the eras that I most identify and most excited by, which would be post-punk, 90s rave, krautrock, maybe the Miles Davis 70s jazz rock. They all bear a very strong imprint of the 60s. They're all in some way extensions of 60s ideas. And what to me characterizes this music, particularly psychedelia, post-punk and rave, is this sort of twin emphasis on the present and the future, both at once, the kind of future now. And in Energy Flash, which a little plug has just come out in a new, expanded, updated edition. In Energy Flash, I talk about techno and house and rave music of all kinds as a kind of now machine, each loop or bar being like this intensified, texturally saturated present moment. But crucially, it's a kind of now that is always kind of tilted forward. It's always leading on to the next now. So it's like, it's unlike, say, drone music or ambient music, which is usually rhythmless, and that creates a kind of sensation of timeless suspension. With electronic dance music, there's this future now effect, and I think it actually has something to do, I argue this in the book, it's to do with its heavy reliance on this musical figure, the vamp, which was originally, I think in jazz, was kind of like a brief introductory passage or figure repeated several times before a solo or verse to sort of whip up anticipation. But in a lot of techno and house music, the whole track is basically, all the music is basically vamps. It's just entirely these anticipatory motifs. But in that respect, I think electronic dance music is really an extension and intensification of what you get in all beat-driven pop and rock, which is this combination of the sensation-saturated present, but always this surging forward. So you would get that in a group like Noi, the very aptly named Noi, new with an exclamation mark. But you also get it in the Steve Miller Band, whose "Fly Like an Eagle" has the chorus, "Fly like an eagle into the future." So pop for me is all about this, excuse my French, libidinal economy of anticipation and restless desire and sort of perpetual movement. And what I think is going on in what I would regard as classic eras of pop, which are precisely those eras devoid of any sense of classicism, of veneration to ancestors, eras that feel like they are brand new, or that believe themselves to be brand new without precedent. In those eras, I would say that what is going on sort of libidinally and rhythmically in the microcosm of any given song mirrors what is going on in the macrocosm of music as a whole. So the song is moving forward, but the movement of the culture is moving forward as well. It's a kind of homology at all levels. What you get in retro rock, say a contemporary song by the Black Keys or virtually any band in covered in The Enemy these days, you get this microcosmic effect of rock and roll urgency, but obviously on the larger level, the music is going backwards. And you have this kind of cruel paradox. You're like listening to it, and you can feel it pulling at your body in the same way that, you know, once timely and therefore timeless songs like Satisfaction or Whole Lot of Love or Marky Moon or What Do I Get pulled at you. But you know you're being tricked, you know, and in fact to submit to this enjoyment would be a betrayal of the larger project of what music should be. So you kind of have to steel yourself against the seductions of these sort of pseudo-now groups. These groups that are the worst in a way because they're talented. They're talented throwbacks, and so they have all these, you know, like the White Stripes. Damn them, you know, because they're good, you know. But it's something you have to refuse. From my point of view, you have to refuse to be seduced by Jack White. And in the three main books I've done, Energy Flash, Rip It Up, and Start Again, and Retromania, they form a kind of a sort of unintended trilogy, and at base they're all about a sort of particular relationship with time, and they're about my own investment, sort of ideologically and libidinally and even neurologically, in that temporality. So the first two are about Energy Flash and Rip It Up. They're both about periods of cultural acceleration, post-punk and the techno-rave 90s. And the third one, Retromania, is about a sense of temporal malaise that I think sets in the 2000s, what I call the 2000s, precisely you know, when the broadband era really kicks off, I think. And it's what this malaise, this temporal malaise, I've come to call it hyperstasis. It's like a kind of stagnant frenzy, a sort of live sensation of restlessness and stuckness, rather like the wheels of a car that are churning desperately to get out of a swamp. So they're going fast, but they're getting nowhere. And I think that is, you know, that in a lot of ways is the phenomenology of digital life as a daily experience. For me anyway, it's like constantly being dragged all over the place by things that are old music, things that are on YouTube, and there are so many ways of being pulled out of the present, I think, through the digital distribution of information. And this, you know, this unintended trilogy of books is also a kind of disguised 3-volume autobiography. It's the memoir of a metabolism, a nervous system, and a perceptual system that's wired in a particular way. But I'm not alone in this. It's quite common to quite a few people of my generation, and I take heart that quite a few people, and not all of them of the same generation, some even young people as well, have experienced similar sensations in the last 10 years. And it's Retromania is not the only book to address this feeling that something has gone awry with time, by which I mean culture time as opposed to chronological, calendrical time, which plods forward as it always has done. In 2011, when Retromania came out, there was also the publication of a book called After the Future by the Italian theorist Franco Berardi, also known as Biffo, strangely. Makes him sound like a clown or something, isn't it? But he's not a clown. He's a very serious guy, and very worried and anxious about the future. And he addresses, in his book, he addresses the passing of what he calls the century that trusted in the future, meaning the 20th century, although it's really the first 6 decades of the 20th century, because by his account, already by the 1970s, confidence in the future is starting to fade. You have the publication of the Club of Rome's book, The Limits to Growth, in 1972, the oil crisis in 73, Punk's No Future in 1977. But nonetheless, in his analysis, the 2000s are the first, you know, it's really, the trust has really gone away in a big way by the 2000s. It's the first decade of a century that doesn't, for whom, so far at least, the future does not equate with promise, you know, the idea of that things are inevitably going to get better. that something really fantastic is around the corner. Recently, Freeze magazine had published a dialogue between Biffo and Mark Fisher, a friend and colleague of mine, and he's another critic who's been registering this sort of sense of uncanny temporal disorientation through his many writings on hauntology, which is soon coming out in a book called Ghosts of My Life. Back in the early 2000s, Rem Koolhaas touched on this idea in his famous text, Junk Space, during the course of which he wrote, "When did time stop moving forward, begin to spool in every direction, like a tape spinning out of control? Change has been divorced from the idea of improvement. There is no progress, like a crab on LSD. Culture wobbles endlessly sideways." It's a fantastic text, if you can find it on the web. Well worth reading. My esteemed colleague Paul Morley has written about the contemporary era of music as the aftermath, a sort of junk heap or flea market piled high with the detritus of the super fast moving 20th century, with current musicians picking through it and sorting into new shapes and rearranging it in endless sort of new collages. In a memorable phrase, Morley has written outwardly impassively, but I think with an implicit disquiet, about the directionless direction of today's pop culture. There have also been more positive readings of the situation. Attempts to conceive this culture time not as a predicament, but as something potentially rich, or at very least unexpected, a significant shift, a new phase. Finally we're beyond postmodernism. So the curator and art theorist Nicolas Bourriaud has these concepts like ultramodernism and post-production art. You have William Gibson with the concept of atemporality. Gibson contrasts his own generation, who made a cult of what he calls the capital F future, with contemporary youth who, he says, inhabit a sort of endless digital now. He thinks atemporality is a pretty cool thing. He likes its manifestations, particularly in fashion. And he says that atemporality is a byproduct of network culture, our increasingly efficient communal prosthetic memory, i.e. these ever-expanding, instantly accessible archives of the internet in which, however much you might try to cling on to them, the distinction between the past and the present gets ever more blurry. And the cyberpunk novelist and Gibson collaborator Bruce Sterling, slightly more anxious about this syndrome than Gibson, nonetheless agrees that the concept of the future is an obsolete paradigm, and he even imagines that the word the future will itself go out of use eventually. And then coming at all this from a somewhat different tack is this year's book by Douglas Rushkoff, Present Shock, which is a sort of grab bag of neologisms and buzz terms. The basic thesis is that our relationship with time, and specifically with the now, is increasingly brittle and besieged by data overload. And one result of this is that projecting forward with long-term plans and goals becomes increasingly impossible. And there have been loads of other people who've talked about the subject. Jaron Lanier is another one. It's not escaped notice, this temporal malaise. And it's begun to figure in all kinds of art and cultural production, both as a sort of subtext and an explicit subject of the work. An example is one of the pop music events of 2013, one of the few that could honestly be described as an event in the old sense of the word. And it's both timely and untimely. Essentially, it's a concerted repudiation of the present. And if historically it will come to define 2013, it'll be through its having rejected 2013. Probably some of you noticed that Daft Punk put a record out this year. And it's an album that's full of references to time, transience, the notion of a lost future, memory. Random Access Memories, the title is a pun on computer memory versus human memory. My favourite song in it is called Fragments of Time, which is about instant nostalgia and the sort of future anterior process where you experience bliss, and then as you experience it, you imagine ahead to looking back at it from the future, as it were. My wife said with disgust that it reminds her of the Doobie Brothers, a part of her youth growing up in 70s America. She has no nostalgia for at all. But the whole album is like reverting to the late 70s and early 80s, to disco funk, the sort of slick, off-the-wall George Benson, Whispers kind, late period prog, soft rock of the Fleetwood Mac and Eagles and Doobies type. And it's a back to analog time travel exercise. There's no sampling, there's no sequencing, no MIDI, just session musicians, live drumming by the dude who drummed for Michael Jackson. And so it's informed, the whole project is informed by this paradox that is specific to Daft Punk's own dilemma as artists who had done sample-based dance, techno, house music, and taken that as far as they could. But it's a paradox that also has wider cultural resonance. How to go forward? Daft Punk decided that the only way was to go back, and partly was that was because the sounds they'd helped to pioneer in the 90s as prominent figures in techno and house culture, these sounds and techniques have become the norm, oppressively so. Even in America, it's top 40 radio. The last country to embrace electronic dance music has finally completely just embraced it wholeheartedly. Mark Fisher has written about this, about how the way he phrased it is, we can no longer hear technology. The future rush that you got from hearing those kinds of sounds in the 90s, and that kind of gave you a sort of glimpse ahead or preview of the 21st century, you don't get that anymore because it's completely normalized. And related to what Stephen was talking about optimization, in digital culture now, we just get, Fisher says, we just get upgrades. We get these sort of increments in ever higher definition, higher definition audio and video. So we stop feeling it as the future. It's just a slightly brighter now, or a slightly sharper image or sound. But obviously this idea of going forward by going backward is clearly flat out contradictory. And Daft Punk are smart guys. When I interviewed them, they were talking, they talked about Jacques Attali's book on noise, about, they went into a lot of detail about how computer-generated imagery doesn't create cinematic magic, whereas physical, special effects made on physical models actually does. They had all these lofty and earnest ideas about art. They're smart guys. So clearly for them to pursue this direction backwards, basically, they must have felt completely blocked in terms of finding a way to the future. They Random Access Memories took, the whole project took 5 years, 2.5 years of solid work spread over 5 years. They spent millions of their own money on this project. They must have felt completely like there was no other way forward for them. The writer Geeta Dayal has described what they did on this record as sampling taken to the next level. They're reconstructing the kind of teams of skilled musicians and sound engineers that made the kind of music that in the 90s Daft Punk liked to sample. But it's more than that, I think. They're trying to reconstruct the whole sort of episteme, the zeitgeist, the larger cultural matrix that produced albums like Rumours, Tusk, Off the Wall, and whatever Doobie Brothers album would go in that list, if any. It's not just the analog way of making a record, it's an analog sense of temporality of the event that they're trying to will back into existence. So hence this, the much discussed promotional campaign with all its teasing hints, the billboards, the teaser ads on TV, this sort of build up, and then finally the climax, this sort of mass synchronized experience of the whole world, slight exaggeration, but the whole world hearing it almost in real time. Very much an attempt to echo, the week that Sgt. Pepper's came out, or the month that Thriller, was #1 for the first time. So, in a lot of ways, this nostalgia for monoculture is also a nostalgia for a kind of mono-temporality, a sort of shared experience of time. And I think fairly clearly this sort of linear, shared experience, this synchrony, is inseparable from concepts like progress and the future. And that's revealed by two key tracks on the Daft Punk album. The first one is Giorgio by Moroder, and on this you have a towering figure of 20th century popular music, Giorgio Moroder, looking back on his own, looking forward. He's interviewed at length, and there are two small snippets used. And the key segment involves the making of I Feel Love, this international #1 hit in 1977. It's the first all-electronic dance track, a song that made Eno rush over to Bowie's house and say, "David, I've heard the future." A song that inspired a band of Tangerine Dream fans from Sheffield, who at that time called themselves The Future, to make future pop under their better-known name, The Human League. And Moroder speaks on the Daft Punk track, Giorgio by Moroder, he speaks of the Donna Summer album on which I Feel Love appeared, which was actually a sort of disco concept album about time called I Remember Yesterday. I'm not going to do his German accent, but he says this: I wanted to do an album with the sounds of the 50s, the sounds of the 60s, of the 70s, and then have a sound of the future. And I thought, wait a second, why don't I use a synthesizer, which is the sound of the future? And he also talks about using a click for this metronomic, mechanical, at the time unheard of sort of machine rhythm. He said, I knew that could be a sound of the future, but I didn't realize how much the impact would be. And so the rest was history, the history of future pop, 80s synth pop, house, techno, trance. So many things can be sourced back to this breakthrough song, I Feel Love. So it's really touching and charming that Daft Punk are playing tribute to Moroder. But what's really interesting is they don't collaborate with him musically. His only presence in this song is his voice, which is the one thing he's not actually famous for, his voice. And neither they nor Moroder, it seems, were capable of making any kind of future music themselves. Instead, what they do on the track is they do a very accurate reproduction of the classic Moroder electronic Eurodisco sound, but rather weakly, so it's much more like the Cat People soundtrack than Sparks' Beat the Clock or Donna Summer's Working the Midnight Shift. Frederick Jameson described the modernist artwork as a monument to the future, but with Giorgio by Moroder we have a monument to a past future. The other key track is the finale to Random Access Memories, this track, Contact. And that starts with a sample voice from a NASA transmission, the Apollo 17 mission, December 1972. And the voice is Eugene Cernan's, the last astronaut to stand on the moon's surface, the last human being on the moon, in fact, to date. And Cernan is talking about, he says, it's a bright object, it's obviously rotating because it's flashing, it's way out in the distance. He describes it in some detail. And then he says, there's something out there. So this track, obviously, it's about the romance of the space race, the final frontier, this mystical sense that there's something out there, and it's our destiny as a species to boldly go. As in Star Trek, also as in Spengler's notion that the essence of Western civilization was a spiritual reaching out into boundless space. Daft Punk don't sample this bit, but what Cernan actually said when he was climbing the ladder back into the lunar module, whatever you call it, the thing that will take him back to Earth. What he said was, as I take man's last step from the surface, back home for some time to come, but we believe not too long into the future, I'd just like to say what I believe history will record, that America's challenger today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. And Contact itself is quite a thrilling track. It's the least dated sounding on Random Access Memories. It could be a Chemical Brothers tune from 1997, which compared to the Doobie Brothers is definite improvement. And there's this rush of sound that's sustained and intensified for quite a long while, but then it sort of sputters out. So there's this sort of sense of, did we achieve liftoff, or did the spacecraft disintegrate as it tries to leave the Earth's atmosphere? I said before that I think of pop culture as being like a kind of battleground for these, future-minded and then nostalgic, archivally based tendencies. And the 50s and the 60s, I think, were definitely dominated by the future-minded. It was very much a bright, plastic kind of looking forward time, especially the 60s. The 70s and 80s, there was a swing back to nostalgia and revivalism and retro. Forces were kind of battling the Kraftwerks and the Marauders and the New Orders. And I think in the 90s, you could say it's more of an evenly matched battle. And indeed, as Stephen suggested by his allusion to 1993, futurism makes something of a comeback in the early to mid 90s. So I'm going to flash back here to a flash forward, an energy flash forward, in fact. In 1993, 20 years ago, which was actually the year that Daft Punk were forming their identity, their debut release came out in 94, and it was a single called The New Wave, before any retro disco or 80s electropop elements entered their work. The tracks sort of pounding acid techno, somewhat generic, but definitely part of this forward surge of the early 90s. I'm not going to play that. I'm going to play another record from that time, a tune that was about as futuristic as things got at an extremely futuristic time for music. I hid because I never know what to do when I play a track. Like I feel like I should dance or something. I'm not. So, the sleep. It's a compilation called The Dark Side. That track was Terminator. Came out in late '92 and was pirate radio smash in early '93. And if you were in London then and tuning in, you seem to hear it like every hour. And it's an early track by Goldie when he was recording under the names like Roughage Crew and Metalheads, and working with a mysterious character called DJ Freebase and this guy Mark from For Hero. And this whole period, 92, 93, 94, was a moment of supremely fast evolution or more like apocalyptic mutation really in techno rave music. Hardcore turned to darkcore, turned to jungle, turned to drum and bass in really the space of just 2 years. And the imagery at the time told you what everyone was feeling, which, you had For Hero did a track called Students of the Future. Noise Factory had a track called Futuroid, and the sample lick in it went, we bring you the future, the future, the future. There was an outfit called Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse with We Are the Future, Omni Trios, Living for the Future, groups with names like Future Assassins or Future Sound of London. Terminator is, obviously named after the film. I think the Terminator 2 had come out the year before or something. And the concept, the conceit is, this record comes from the future, like the cyborg assassin. And it has the sample of Sarah Connor's voice saying, you're talking about things I haven't done yet. It's a future anterior. But other aspects to it also that are futuristic. Goldie and his comrades were misusing technology called time stretching. So they were changing the pitch of the drums so that the breakdowns, it actually sounds like it's speeding up yet staying in tempo at the same time. So you have this kind of jagged time-lapse effect. And at the time I wrote about this kind of music, hardcore turning into jungle, turning into drum and bass, basically, as being rhythmic psychedelia, a quantum leap for music as significant as Tomorrow Never Knows had been in its era. And it was totally psychedelic music. Literally, it was totally linked to drug culture. In fact, Goldie took ecstasy when he was doing the final mix down of Terminator. He wanted to expand his sonic perceptions. He told one interviewer, that on E, you hear things that aren't there. And in a sense, I suppose he's trying to hear into the future, maybe in some sense. So fueled in large part by ecstasy, which is essentially in its effects, not chemically, but in its effects, is psychedelic amphetamine. This was an era of speed. Future Symposium London's album was actually called, their debut album was called Accelerator. And listening to Terminated, I feel is of this propulsive linearity. The music is all vamps. It's a microcosm in its structure of what was happening to rave at the macro level, which was you had all these different directions coming out of house and techno, and they reach like kind of hurtling along this extensional axis of intensification, speed, hardness, darkness, sickness, abstraction. So it was not just tilted towards the next now, it was like racing after it. And I think that's actually the point of the future as a cultural ideal, is really not so much what the future is going to be like, but it's the intensity it creates in the now. The future is the unattainable object. It's this horizon you chase but never reach. But the chase of it is what creates propulsion in the present, this sort of feeling of speed, really. It's having a speed mind or a speed body or a speed flesh. And 93, I would say, was a particularly fast year in a longer period from roughly 1990 to, let's say, 96, where everything is in music. Not everything, as I'll discuss, but the bit I was watching, anyway, everything is moving and everything is mutating. So in 93, you had GABA, which was ultra-fast techno from Northern Europe. I understand it was quite popular up here as well. And probably the equivalent figure to Goldie or For Hero is this guy called Mark Akardipane from Frankfurt, whose main name was, his name alias was The Mover. He had about a dozen other names he used. And he made tracks like We Have Arrived, Night Flight, Non-Stop to Chaos. Akardipane had this whole mythos about the year 2017. It was like his own private version of the singularity. And again, I think the whole point of that is it's not really about what 2017 is going to be like or getting there. It's the sensation. It's the point is to create a sensation of speeding up in the present. In 1993, 2017 is a long way off. It's just around the corner for us, obviously. But so you know, it's about in some ways he should have said it further ahead. You know, I think give himself more time. But you know, one of his tracks, I think revealingly, one of his greatest tracks is called Apocalypse Never. And there's almost a sense that you want the feeling of impending apocalypse, but you don't necessarily want the apocalypse, as it were. And in all electronic music at that time, there was this sense of tremendous rapid development. You know, in trance, minimal techno. You had outfits and figures like Basic Channel, Autechra, Aphex Twin, and it was going on outside dance, on the edge of dance, My Bloody Valentine, post-rock with outfits like Seafeel and Disco Inferno. It was so much going on. And living through this period of music, particularly if you were immersed in the rave thing, the actual sensation of being a fan of this music was of teleology, the feeling that something was unfolding through the music, it was going somewhere. And each phase of the music, each new next phase of the music superseded the previous one. It was like the stages of a rocket sort of being jettisoned as the rocket leaves the Earth's atmosphere. And for critics writing about this music at the time, like myself or Kojo Eshin, you rarely found yourself using reference points. You wouldn't use historical coordinates based on earlier music, because the new music was going off the map. And you were racing to keep up with the music, and that required new concepts, new language, neologisms, new genre terms. And also another thing that was different was if you compare, say, the way people review records now, a lot of reviews this year, I've noticed, whether it's The Enemy writing about a band like Peace, or this band, the post-punk influenced band Savages, or Daft Punk's album, often they tend to be written as in a semi-apologetic tone, like an apologia, basically all saying, okay, it's not breaking new ground, but it's a fresh recombination, and it's sort of timely, and above all, the kids love it. But with Jungle and all this other stuff, there was no apologia. There was no attempt to justify it. This was self-evidently new music, and it demanded exaltation. It was like demanded a mode of address that sort of combined the the scientific, and the evangelical. This sort of hyped up evangelical discourse wasn't limited to music writing. You would get a similar sort of tone in magazines coming out of the Silicon Valley, West Coast culture. Mondo 2000 was one at that time that quite a lot of people read, and it was sort of somewhere between it was sort of a transitional magazine between cyberpunk and zippy. Zippy was this word briefly used meaning hippie-ish types who didn't have a fear of technology, basically. So that would be cats like Are You Serious and Yaron Lanier, and some of the people like Bruce Sterling and William Gibson were sort of part of that scene as well. 1993 was the year that Wired magazine was started, and it was actually a much more interesting magazine than the Condé Nast title it is today. Although it did always have this kind of technophile, libertarian, capitalist ideology underpinning it. In academia around this time, you would have had Sadie Plant would have been about to form the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit with Nick Land, and that was a real hotbed of extremely overheated, near-mystical intellectual energy. You had figures like Mark Fisher was part of that at that time. Steve Goodman, who's better known as Code 9, the DJ producer and the boss of Hyperdub Records, he was part of the CCRU. You had C Theory, the journal based around Arthur Croker and Mary Louise Croker in Canada, that was doing all kinds of tripped out stuff like Data Trash and Spasm Flesh were the typical titles of books they put out. So there was a lot of cyber theory being formulated, and it was some of it was kind of utopian and this is great. Some of it was very dystopian, like the Croker stuff, but most of it was a kind of indissoluble mix of the two. It was kind of dysphoria was the mode, thing. This technology is going to be controlling us, but the world will be excitingly apocalyptic. So that's good. So in a more humdrum way, for me, I do recall 93, 94 as, for me at least, the kind of threshold year for the internet. Because for me, what really got me excited about it was actually Kurt Cobain's death in 1994. Not that I was very sad that he killed himself, but it was the first time I noticed really the World Wide Web was this phenomenon, because my wife had been exploring it, and then suddenly Cobain killed himself, and this might be inconceivable, but at that time there was like 2 small paragraphs in The Guardian, and that was it. In the British newspapers there was hardly anything about it. So if you wanted to find out about Cobain, you had to go online, and instantly all these communities of grief-stricken fans were paying tribute and gathering news and speculating about what had happened. And so you could find yourself eavesdropping on Pete Shelley of the Buzzcocks, who was, I think, a kind of computer geek and early adopter of technology. He had toured with Nirvana, and so he would be there offering counsel to grief-stricken Kurt Cobain fans. But along with all this, technology-based and techno-music-based excitement, 93 was also the year in which the forces of reaction were gathering strength. It was the first real stirrings of Britpop. 20 years and 1 month ago, the fateful day, the release of Blur's Modern Life is Rubbish. 20 years and 1 month ago, in this very town, Alan McGee faithfully stepped into King Tut's Wawa and saw Oasis playing bottom of the bill to Creation's own 18-wheeler and a band called Sister Lovers, and signed them on the spot. Other occurrences of retro culture significance at this time would include the rise of Quentin Tarantino. Reservoir Dogs was 92, Pulp Fiction was 94, and just as record store clerks had already begun to ruin alternative rock through their excessive geeky knowledge, Tarantino represented this phenomenon of the video store clerk as the auteur director, making movies about movies. A few years before 93, the emerging genre of steampunk reached public consciousness with The Difference Engine by Bruce Sterling and William Gibson. And as a genre and a subculture, it just has continued to get bigger and bigger. It's It's infiltrated Hollywood with the Sherlock Holmes movies. In my own hometown, Pasadena, there's no less than 2 steampunk stores. And steampunk and I think Harry Potter, and that was the first one of them was published in '97, so it's sort of in this period, the early to mid '90s. They both are manifestations of a kind of reinvented literature of the marvelous. They have some of the appeal of science fiction, the gizmo technology, access to special powers, but formally they are reactionary. They're like a reversion to more or less 19th century popular storytelling. And they're part of a wider trend in fiction in the last 15 years or so, popular fiction, and that's a return to these sort of long narrative forms, very populous characters, teeming with subplots, often regressive in terms of their ideas of psychology or motivation. And so, what should we make of this strange resurgence of basically certainly pre-modernist, and in some cases pre-modern modes of storytelling? Some of them resemble the long winding narratives of the medieval saga. And in his book, Digimodernism, Alan Kirby argues that this kind of fiction and all the movies that come out of it, which he calls children's entertainment, this defines our era, and one of the reasons it has a digicultural quality, in his words, onwardness and endlessness, which is a characteristic of a lot of digital stuff, is that there's no limits to it. A blog entry could be as long as a book if you wanted it to be. Games you can pretty much carry on playing forever, or at least for a really, really long time. So endlessness here doesn't mean infinity in the sort of mystical or utopian sense, but it means interminability, the game or the narrative that is capable of endless protraction and complication. And Alan Kirby, in his book, which is well worth reading, he asserts that Tolkien has proven to be the most influential writer of the 20th century. And he says, it's also noteworthy that Bram Stoker's influence has come back. It's mediated through all these recent modernizations of the vampire legend, and you have the huge boom of zombie films and TV. And one place where Tolkien and video games and the new sword and sorcery and supernatural entertainment, where they all converge, is in the extremely popular series of novels and TV show Game of Thrones. And what interests me as someone who grew up on science fiction and based on those twin concepts of the future and of space that are sort of mourned in the Daft Punk album. What interests me is how Game of Thrones displaces and supersedes those sort of twin desires. Its world is fantastical, but it's terrestrial, it's earthbound, and it's not set in the future, but in a sort of postmodern, scrambled pseudo-past. George R.R. Martin, the author, did tons of historical research, but as David Benioff, the writer who adapted it for Thrones for TV, observes, it's built on a vaguely Western medieval skeleton, but he's pulling from the Mongols, Native Americans, India. All these elements get woven together into this new tapestry. And Benioff might have also mentioned the War of the Roses, zombies, Caligula, Hadrian's Wall, much, much more. It's all in the mix there. I think what's interesting about the success of the books and the TV show and the sort of larger genre of entertainment that it represents, it shows that people, particularly young people, they still have this impulse to escape the here and now and to go into a world of adventure and heroism. But in the absence of a sort of cultural image or ideal of the future, and with the fading of space travel as any kind of real prospect, these stories take place in a world that is old but doesn't correspond to any actually occurring historical past. And as with steampunk, there's this sort of visually fetishistic love of all the details of the olden days, the costumes and the complicated yet antiquated appliances and machinery, the weapons, the games, but there's no concern with historical accuracy. The other notable characteristic of Game of Thrones is the onwardness and endlessness that Kirby writes about. It's a series of novels, each very long in themselves, the series potentially extendable forever, like a movie franchise. And there's this sort of scrofulous profusion and convolution of narratives, plural really. I call it this syndrome, which is not unique to Thrones. I call it plotitis. It's not the end of narrative, but it's kind of metastasizing, like cancerous growth. I also call it lostitis after the show Lost, because being a lapsed sort of form of science fiction fan, it used to irritate me enormously that this absurd, make it up as you go along show would be described as science fiction. Game of Thrones I actually enjoy, but in a kind of curious way. I'm fairly bright, but I get completely lost with this show. There's too much going on, too many characters, and really I just relax. I enjoy it as a series of discontinuous scenes, more or less. Torture and tits and torture, beards, cool costumes, and regional British accents, basically, is what it is. And I read Lord of the Rings as a kid, but by the time I was a teenager, I was into science fiction. This is what I was into just before I got into post-punk music and music writing of the kind that Paul Morley did at Enemy. And it was a particular kind of science fiction. It was the high end of speculative fiction. It was based around inner space and near future scenarios, not so much alien civilizations and Frank Herbert and Dune and that kind of thing. And if you were a fan of this sort of serious mind-expanding science fiction, you absolutely despised the genre of sword and sorcery. It was the opposite of everything you admired in the genre of science fiction, because it involved this sort of, it was a suspension really of any kind of causal logic or extrapolation from current trends to a plausible future scenario. To me, proper science fiction was the historical method projected forwards, not pseudo-medieval fantasy. So for me, the rise of all this post-Tolkien's children's literature and entertainment as a dominant force in popular culture, I find it disconcerting. It feels regressive to me, and it's also another big sign of this general trend towards the de-libidinization of tomorrow. Basically, the future is no longer sexy. And partly that's because the future has become a set of visual and sonic cliches that seem corny and played out. Kind of thing that only, Will.i.am of Black Eyed Peas really still believes in, looking at the videos that he makes. But mainly it's been de-libidinized. It's not sexy because it's a source of anxiety, the future, It's something not to anticipate, but to be worried about. And when there are science fiction movies made today, they are all cataclysmic, apocalyptic, end-of-world scenarios or aftermath scenarios. I did read recently in The Guardian there's actually a sort of a resurgence of speculative near-future fictions, but it's a genre called cli-fi, climate fiction. And so it's all about calamitous changes to the Earth ecology and climate. And in fact, one of the novels in this mini genre is called Odds Against Tomorrow. So, at the macro level, you have, governments today seem unable to plan for the sort of impressive long-term projects they used to do, like rural electrification in America or building huge dams. But also, world governments are unable to cooperate to deal with really huge pressing problems like global warming. And then on the micro individual level, it just seems harder and harder for us to formulate positive mental images of the future. And particularly, I think if you're young, if you're leaving. I was probably one of the last generation when student grants. Most people didn't leave college with debt, but nowadays people leave with astronomical debts, but then with very few jobs available, maybe an endless series of internships that end up leading to nothing. The prospect of living with your parents indefinitely. So it's easy to see why, for people in that situation, it must feel like the pause button has been pressed on your life, and you can't actually make a nice, plausible picture of where you'll be in 10 years' time. Alongside this sort of delibidinization of the future, I think outer space as a public concept, as it were, or a source of excitement, that has just faded away completely. From the mid-70s onwards, the projects just got less and less impressive. The shuttle never captured the public imagination. Recently, even that program was discontinued, and the shuttles were taken on a lugubrious tour of the USA before being shunted into museums. You can also track it in the sharp decline of ufology, the research and documentation of flying saucers. As James Gray discusses in a recent piece in the Humanist magazine, UFO magazine closed in 2004, the Ministry of Defense shut down its UFO hotline. There's fewer and fewer sightings, and interestingly, ufologists today mostly reanalyze much earlier legendary sightings from the 80s or 50s. So even ufology has become like archival. It's like a backward-looking subject. And one hypothesis Gray has in his piece in The Humanist is that this reflects the syndrome known as cultural tracking. So UFO sightings were at their height when popular culture was full of movies and stories about aliens in outer space. And these have now obviously been replaced by post-apocalyptic movies, zombie movies, vampires, werewolves, witches, and so on. So you get less sightings. But then that just begs the question, why have the zombie, vampire, witch movies eclipsed both science fiction and space fiction as popular fare? Both future and outer space represent the unknown. And in Retromania, I argue that the dominant model for artists, musicians particularly in the 60s, was the astronaut, the explorer of new frontiers. And that today most musicians and many artists and designers are much closer to archaeologists or archivists. A related concept in the 60s was inner space, which J.G. Ballard and other writers at New Worlds magazine derived from surrealism and the discovery of the unconscious, the dream world. And I think that's another set of ideas that have also become passé, this sort of idea of the inner depths or the sort of wilderness, psychic wilderness within. Dream, the word dream as a word now seems to me to become almost completely despiritualized, is stripped of mystery. Like if you use the word dream in popular parlance, it refers to dreaming of being famous or dreaming of becoming a millionaire. I just read about Drake's dreams. He dreamed that he would make $25 million by the age of 25, and now he's upped his dream. He wants to make $250 million by the age of 30. That's a dream now. So this idea of the strangeness within the psyche that fuels art, I think that's another relic of the 20th century. Space in both the outer and inner senses has been displaced, I think, by what was once called cyberspace, now a quaint term, obviously, kitsch almost. Most of all, an inaccurate term, because online isn't like how William Gibson imagined it in Neuromancer. It's not spacious, there aren't distances you traverse like a pilot in a jet, which I think is his metaphor in Neuromancer. Online is the zone of absolute proximity. Everything that is and ever was crammed right next to everything else, separated only by a few taps and clicks. Nonetheless, I still think that you could say that our desire to go and to go fast has imploded into the internet. It's a generational shift of some enormity. And to bring out that generational shift in this last bit, I'm going to make it very personal and contrast it with my son, looking at what we have in common and what we don't. He is nearly 14, the age I would have been when I got into Ballard and Philip K. Dick. And obviously, as I mentioned, I grew up with science fiction and Doctor Who and cosmic 60s music, Alien, glam. There was, still excitement about the moon landings and Soyuz and the Viking unmanned mission to Mars in 1976. There was a lot of stuff in the colour supplements about new ideas in astrophysics, black holes and whatever. And you had, things like Eric von Daniken's books about aliens landing and stuff. It was a big part of the backdrop to life in the 70s. And my sense is that none of these things, outer space, the possibility of alien life, the mysteries of space-time, have the slightest purchase on my son's imagination. When he reads, it's these multi-volume mega-narratives like Game of Thrones, or when he was younger, Harry Potter. Mostly, though, he's into games, social media, YouTube, everything to do with computers and the internet. I can navigate that realm fairly well, but I obviously have all these embedded cultural and neurological memories of analog life. My son is a complete digital native, and to him, this is the real world, and it kind of has precedence over the real world, of South Pasadena, where we live, as well as an indifference to outer space. I really think my son Kieran doesn't actually live with an idea of the future as a cultural idea. Obviously, time is unfolding in a linear direction. He might have very vague thoughts about college, whatever, but there is no discernible excitement about the future with a capital F, no sense that it'll be better or even drastically different. I think partly that's because it has something to do with not having a specific date to project towards, like 1999 or 2000 or 2001. These are dates that if you grew up in the 60s and the 70s, and even to an extent still in the 80s, they would set reverberations through you. Just the sight of those numerals was thrilling. And you really you imagined that once you crossed that date line, you'd be in some totally transformed world. And I don't think we have any sort of mental pictures now, or even vague expectations about 2050 or 2100. I think we know deep in our bones that in 2050 businessmen will be still wearing ties and suits, that the top speed for vehicular transport will be well within the current range, and the same for airborne travel. And there's also an awful and dawning suspicion that popular music might actually be rather similar to how it is now. Just warning you there. But to me, there's more than the future thing. It's this non-cathexis with space as a category that's what is most interesting to me for my son. I really get the sense that everything that is happening, all the action is inside, literally indoors. He is not interested really in outdoors, and he doesn't look at the sky particularly. But particularly, he's inside in the sense of the non-space or post-space in which things like Minecraft take place. That is his big obsession. It's the center of his existence, really. I think this is something that James Bridle has mentioned maybe early on in his writings on the new aesthetic, Minecraft as having something aesthetically in common with the NA, this sort of blocky Lego kind of look about it. There's, this is a new relationship with space that you get with something like Minecraft. It's about building or customizing worlds, personalizing them. It's also playing it can involve complete transcendence of space. My son plays it with an old friend of his in New York, simultaneous with a new friend of his in LA, where we now live, who will actually be with him in the room. And then he plays it with people he's never met. He doesn't know who they are or where geographically they are situated. One thing that intrigued me, I was asking him about Minecraft and what it meant to him, and he mentioned that the particular look he likes, he uses the word retro to it, which interested me, having written a book called Retromania. But it doesn't seem to signify, the word retro doesn't seem to signify much to him. It's not nostalgic, it's just an aesthetic choice, and perhaps maybe what he means by that is he means a more clunky and artificial and therefore appealingly unreal look, maybe, is what is the appeal of retro, or 8-bit or whatever. There's these huge differences between the father and the son, but there's also a kind of chip off the block aspect at work, insofar as he's completely caught up in the psychology of obsession, in the same way that I was and have been. But it's even more, for him, it's even more bound up with obsolescence. Like, he burns through all the latest increments in digital technology, new games and new apps, and his computer can never be fast enough for him. But still, on the level of metabolism, we're kind of very close, really. We're wired for the chase. Kieran exists within his own kind of propulsive linearity. You know, he's racing after the latest thing, he's discarding the passé. And this lends his life a sense of speed, the same kind of speed that, you know, was in that track Terminator, and in the speed of the post-punk era, chasing after the latest twist in the post-punk story. It's the same kind of psychology and excitement. It's also, like I've noted, he is at a difficult age, so it might have something to do with it, but it's a sort of irritable excitation. He's a grumpy little bugger sometimes, because he's always wanting to be on the computer and he doesn't like to be dragged into family life. So there's this kind of anticipation, impatience kind of syndrome that he's locked into. But one thing I have noticed, as far as I can tell, this sort of interest in the new, does seem to be uncoupled from any sort of sense of progress in the cultural or artistic or political sense. In his book, The Archaeology of the Future, which is about science fiction, Frederick Jameson talks about the desire called utopia, which I think the future, in the old capital F sense, and outer space or space, I think that those are objects of the desire called utopia, as it were. However, perhaps for my son and his generation, Minecraft and similar things aren't about the desire called utopia. Perhaps they just are a fully achieved utopia. Perhaps they've got it, you know. Perhaps they don't need the capital F future or space in the out there sense, you know. Perhaps they don't need to, you know, they don't need to read a magazine called New Worlds. They are actually in new worlds. They're living science fiction. So thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over to Paul Morley.